Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming this afternoon to this Talks on the Rock. My name is Bianca Perla. I am the co-director of Vashon Nature Center. And this Talks on the Rock is part of a partnership with Vashon Nature Center and Vashon Center for the Arts called the Heron Meadow Partnership. And we steward the Heron Meadow that's just to the side here. It's a 2.5 acre wetland. And then we also work with Vashon Center for the Arts to combine art, culture, and science around nature to give people more of an awareness of nature and in hopes that we become better stewards of our natural world. So this talk tonight is going to be fabulous and transforming, I have a feeling. I just got a chance to talk with our speaker, and I'm really excited for this. We ask that your cell phones are silenced for this, and you also got a piece of paper when you walked in the room. That's a survey. If you could sign, or if you could fill that out at the end and deliver it to the front desk, that would be wonderful. That informs Judy of how people respond to this music and these talks. And then I'd want to, before we start, talk a few quick announcements for the next talks coming up. There's a Talks on the Rock on March 22nd, 11:30 to 1. That's Rebecca Albiani's Art History Series. And then after that, we have one more co-sponsored talk with Vashon Nature Center and Vashon Center for the Arts, and that's all about kelp, which is a big subject here on the island now. So that might be something to put on your calendars. That will be on April 5th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. And Gray McKenna from Puget Sound Restoration Fund is going to be talking about kelp conservation and ecology and restoration at that talk. So now on to our speaker today. We are so blessed to have Judy Twedt with us this afternoon, and she will be presenting new music driven by climate change data, which is composed to help us shift from a culture of short-termism to the long-term outlook that we need to respond to climate change, multigenerational. And Judy's idea for this climate-based music came to her during her doctoral program in the atmospheric sciences and climate modeling at University of Washington. After completing her master's, she shifted her focus to making this music from climate data using a technique called sonification. And this work has been presented in TED Talks and in various museums and radio shows around the world. And if you happen to be in Washington, D.C., this Earth Day, you can catch another performance of her work at the National Gallery of Art, which is really exciting. So Judy is also an islander, and she lives here with her partner, toddler, and 2 cats, and she has been on Coast Salish land for 6 generations in this area. So welcome, Judy. We're really excited to have you. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Bianca, for that really warm introduction, and this also feels like a very warm space. I was so delighted to see, so I grew up in Tacoma, that my first grade teacher has come to this talk. Lots of familiar, friendly faces in the audience, so that's really a wonderful gift. I've given a lot of talks on climate change, but this is the first talk that I've given as a parent. So it'll be a little different because I'm a little different now. 3 years ago, before I was a parent, I was interviewing young Alaska natives in Anchorage about their experiences with climate change. Now, Alaska and all of the Arctic is ground zero for climate breakdown. It's happening twice as fast there. Infrastructure like airport runways need to be insulated against the thawing permafrost underneath them. Sea ice is melting, and animals are struggling to adapt to the rapid rate of changing ecosystems. Polar bears face possible extinction this century, and some indigenous communities are already relocating because their homes are falling into the sea, literally. So Haley Hannah Stepton, who I was interviewing, is an Unangak woman who I knew as a fellow graduate student at the University of Washington. And she talked with me about her subsistence lifestyle on the Aleutian island of Akutan and her relationship to traditional dance, something that she practiced in graduate school. She said, and I quote, "My dance is a ceremony. It's an homage to the animals and non-human life. It's enacting this way of life that ensured that we were living sustainably." So I left that interview feeling like I was culturally deprived. I didn't have any traditions that ensured that I, as a fifth-generation settler on these Coast Salish lands, was living sustainably. I had no cultural practices for paying homage to animals or non-human life. Then I birthed a baby who is now 20 months old, and as she began to use words and gestures for communication, I realized that she doesn't discriminate between humans and animals and plants or airplanes. So when we go out walking, she greets airplanes and the ferns she recognizes with a "hi." We didn't teach her to do that, so she's got me wondering if it's part of our nature to feel a connection to plants and non-human animals, something that might come before culture if we keep it alive. In our dominant culture, it's common to feel disconnected, and it's common to feel distracted. We're bombarded with stimulus that trains our attention to short-term thinking, weekly deadlines, quarterly profits, urgent ads about another sale ending soon, and a 24-hour news cycle of endless stories of violence and political dysfunction. But today, I'm going to share with you some sound compositions. You might consider them music or not. I've made them with data from the earth. Like Haley Hanna's dance, these pieces are an homage to the earth and an invitation for you, the listeners, to feel a different kind of connection to this planet that sustains us. So for the next 40 minutes or so, I invite you to settle into a slower pace as we get acquainted with a few data sets that tell us stories about the earth. The 4 pieces that I'll play for you today are all motivated by a single question. How do we orient our lives toward multigenerational time scales? This question, I think, gets at the foundation of climate action. And I've been thinking about this question of scale for a long time, and I've been reading in fields of psychology and science education for answers. We have tools to help us understand large spatial scales. These tools include traveling and standing before natural wonders like this edge of the ice sheet. We also have photographs and satellite images and even telescopes that show us vast spatial scales. But those are spatial scales. So how do we practice thinking and living on long time scales? The compositions you'll hear today are all representations of climate data. Normally, we take data and turn it into visual graphs, but we can just as well take those numbers and turn them into sounds, and that's what I do. So all of these pieces are composed algorithmically, using records of atmospheric carbon dioxide. The extremely high emissions of this gas are the primary cause of climate breakdown, although methane also accounts for a good chunk of the heating too. Carbon dioxide traps heat near the earth and acts like an insulating blanket. For each piece that you'll hear, I've created digital instruments with computer code. Those instruments take in numbers and they output sound. So we're going to start with data from the last century and work our way back in time, piece by piece. Our cleanest record of atmospheric carbon dioxide is from a weather station on Mauna Loa, Hawaii. It's run by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. This location is important because it's out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, far away from the biggest sources of pollution. Now, I know that you all know that CO2 is going up. So my point in these pieces is not to just communicate the rampant rise of CO2, but rather for us to listen to how it changes on different timescales and to learn to adjust our attention to these different timescales. So we're first going to listen to 5 years of data starting in 1988. Then we'll listen to 5 more starting in 2014. To help us remember these scales, I've made a little timeline on the stage. It's a blue piece of tape. Don't worry if you can't see it. And I'm going to mark our current year, 2023, and then the beginning of each piece on the other end to help you visually kind of remember what timescales we're going. So let me do that now. Okay, here's one end of our timeline. And the other. All right. So we're going to be starting back in time and going up to the present. So I'm going to put the present year here, 2023. And our first piece starts in 1988. That'll go at the beginning of our timeline. There. So this will become more useful as we add more points to the timeline. Now, the first piece you'll listen to is in situ 1998. So that's the number we have there. And in situ, by the way, means that the data was measured in its original place. So in this case, atmospheric carbon dioxide is measured directly in the atmosphere. The piece uses weekly, monthly, and yearly average data. And the beat represents 1 month of time, playing one beat, 1 month from 1998 to 1993. The duration is 1 minute and 17 seconds. For each piece, I'll give you the same kind of information. Now, I've made 3 different digital instruments for this piece, and you'll hear them one by one in a little sample before I play the whole thing. Let me tell you what they are. There's one instrument that plays the weekly levels of CO2. There's one instrument that plays the monthly averages of CO2, and there's a long bell-sounding instrument that plays the yearly average. So let's listen to that sample now. It's the weekly average. That's the sound of 1 month, each ding. And that's the sound that's held over an entire year. Again, we'll be listening to 5 years of data. The rhythm in this piece comes from ratios. There's either 4 or 5 weeks played for every month, and there's 12 months played for every year. So as you listen, don't worry if you forget these details. Just remember to keep in mind higher pitch means higher levels of CO2. Let's listen. So 5 years of data from the carbon record, which you listened to in about 1 minute. You might have noticed the CO2 went up and down each year. That's because the spring and summer growth in vegetation sucks some of the CO2 out of the air through photosynthesis. And you might have heard the small rise in CO2 year by year, but it's not easy to hear on a 5-year timescale. So let's jump forward to 2014. I used the same algorithm in this piece, so it has the same 3 instruments. It's just going from 2014 to 2019. Now you'll listen to that one. 5 more years. If you hadn't listened to the earlier record from 1988 just a moment ago, it might not sound high, right? Even when listening on 5-year timescales, it's not easy to discern the rise of carbon. And yet, how often do we even think on 5-year timescales? Here's what that in situ record looks like graphically. This is the whole record starting from 1958 to the present. It's rising and falling a little every year. That's because of that photosynthetic effect from the seasons with vegetation. But it's mostly rising, and it hasn't slowed down very much. Okay, next we're going to listen to a very different temporal perspective. The last geologic period, which we call the Holocene. The Holocene began with the retreat of the last ice age about 12,000 years ago and is now ending from human-caused climate change. Where do we get data from 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, before then? We get it from the coldest place on Earth, Antarctica. This continent is covered in a vast ice sheet. Each year, snow falls on that ice sheet, and it's so cold there that the snow never melts. So you have layer upon layer upon layer of snow falling, and over time that compacts into ice. And the snowflakes trap tiny bubbles of air in them, so those layers of snow preserve records of the air from the time when they fell to the ground. Ice cores are like Earth's archives. They allow us to study bubbles from long ago. The next 2 compositions use data from ice cores in Antarctica. Requiem for the Holocene is the title of this talk. In a minute, I'll play that piece that represents the carbon record over the Holocene era. The ice core data that I'm using is shown here. That's the ice core, not that big. And the bubbles that are trapped in the ice you can view here. And this is a sample of the layer upon layer of ice in an ice core. So the Holocene composition uses data that starts 10,000 years ago and goes to the present. Okay, let's update our timeline. So now this end is going to represent 10,000 years ago. And now if I'm going to mark 1998 on this timeline, 1988, excuse me, it's going to go right about here. Okay. So the representation of time in this piece is not linear like in the last 2 pieces, and that's because over most of the Holocene period, there was very little change in atmospheric carbon dioxide. The change is only significant in the last few hundred years. So the piece starts with 10,000-year-old data, and for the first half of the piece, 1 beat represents 75 years passing. Then I start temporally zooming in, so 1 beat represents 50 years, then 10, 5, 3, and finally at the very end, 1 beat represents 1 year. This allows us to zoom in over the recent period where change is happening the fastest. Now, to help your ears kind of hear and tune into this, I've included a percussion instrument that plays the number of years per beat as a little thud sound. The thing is, the musicians in the audience will know this, if you're playing thuds at 50 or 75 times per second, they blur together. You can't hear them as thuds. You hear them as kind of a engine revving sound. So you're going to hear that in the piece. You can imagine this piece is like watching a flip book being turned. So at first we're flipping really fast and it looks like a motion picture, and then it slows down and you start to see each image separately. So here's what that percussive sound instrument sounds like at 75 years, and then I just kind of jump forward so you can hear it at 50, 10, 3, and 1. This is 75 years per second. right? So it goes down to 50, it gets a little lower, 10, it's going, and then you'll hear each individual thud at 3 and 1. And so, that's all right. So there's a couple more things to say first before we listen. The atmospheric CO2 record, the actual data, is represented by a short melody in this piece, and that melody shifts up or down with the CO2. The piece starts 10,000 years ago. That's roughly the end of the last ice age, when much of North America was covered by the Laurentide ice sheet. For more context, that's also, roughly speaking, when large megafauna like the woolly mammoth and the saber-toothed tiger went extinct. Now we'll listen. So that was 10,000 years of data expressed over about 4 minutes. Human civilization has grown out of a very stable climate period. Earth's average temperature didn't change very much for the last 10,000 years. Here's what that data looks like visually. flat, 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 boom. This is why I needed to zoom in temporally, because I didn't want you to be listening for 10 minutes to the same melody repeated over and over again. I do think about our attention spans a little bit. So I'd like to invite you now to take a few breaths. If this makes you feel any tension, notice that, and breathe. Now we're going to shift our attention to even longer time scales. You heard how stable CO2 was over the Holocene, but what about before the Holocene, during the last ice age and before then? We're lucky to have ice core records that go back 800,000 years. I've taken these records and I've interpolated them into a timeline that has one data point every 2,000 years. So let's update our timeline now. 800,000 years is going to go here at the beginning of our piece. And 10,000 years, how far do you think this is going to go over now? It's going to be about 5 centimeters to the right of this one by my calculations. So there. It's really hard to grasp these scales, so doing every different thing I can, sound, visuals. Here we go. So the 800,000-year-old record I call glaciation. It's the piece I've made. And it shows us that there have been 9 different glacial interglacial cycles. So a glacial interglacial cycle is a period when glacial cycles when the ice sheets are reaching toward the tropical regions and the Earth is very cold. An interglacial cycle is when the ice sheets recede, like we're in an interglacial cycle right now. The Earth's warmer, there's more vegetation at higher latitudes. So I've composed this piece around these 9 different glacial cycles. You're going to hear a kind of swelling sound as CO2 rises and the Earth warms up, and that's indicating that the Earth was coming out of an ice age. Then you'll hear the sounds get quieter and lower as the Earth goes back into another ice age. There are 4 different layers to this piece, so this is the longest piece and also the most complex. A beating sound represents orbital motion. That's because small wobbles in the way the Earth orbits around the sun are responsible for these glacial interglacial cycles. So I wanted to give the impression of orbital sound and orbital motion in this piece. Another instrument plays a simple pitch that slides up and down with the CO2 record. So there's 1 beat for every 2,000 years, and that doesn't change like in the last piece. That's constant. Then there's a low humming instrument that's sustained every 3 beats, so that's driven by the data also, so it goes up and down a little with CO2. And then lastly, there's a long sustained pitch that's held over the whole glacial cycle, and then that quiets down, and then you hear another one. So my intention in creating these different layers is to hear the different glacial cycles and to give a feeling of deep time. So let's listen to the separate layers first. This is the beating sound. This is the CO2 every 2,000 years. Sustained over 3 beats, so 6,000 years. This is a pitch that's sustained over a whole glacial cycle. So at just under 7 minutes, this is the longest and the last of the pieces you'll hear today. At the very end, you'll hear that today's level of CO2, it goes so high, so fast, that you might not hear it. That's okay. Here's what that carbon record looks like visually. I added vertical lines to show you the different interglacial cycles. There's 9 there. Did you maybe notice that the change in CO2 over these ice age cycles is actually quite a bit smaller than the rise in CO2 over the past few hundred years? The rate at which our global economy has dug up and burned fossil fuels is truly astounding. So now we've heard the carbon record on several different timescales, from the weekly ups and downs to these long glacial, interglacial cycles that span hundreds of thousands of years before humans walked on the Earth. There are also other ways to practice thinking on long timescales. Lately, I've been turning to climate fiction writers, people who are writing about futures that we might want to live into. I found that it takes effort to resist despair or fear of the future, especially when you're informed by the science. And what I appreciate about climate fiction, this is a new and emerging genre, is that it helps to loosen the grip of this present reality on our minds so that we can imagine different futures, truly different futures. Because after all, we're living right now in the future of generations of women who first imagined equal suffrage and then made it real. Or the future of generations of abolitionists who first imagined the end of slavery and then made it real. And we're also living in the future of generations of colonizers who stole land from indigenous people and privatized and exploited it for profit. My point is this: what we set our attention, where we set our attention, and what we imagine of the future matters greatly. So, to finish, I want to invite all of you to participate in a creative experiment with me. We've just listened to data from the past, and it portends big change ahead. But the future is not yet written, so I'm wondering if we can improvise together a little climate jazz. Never done this before, I have no idea what to expect. So here are some instruments that you might play from your seat. Very low stress, right? You could clap your hands, representing clean transportation. Bicycles, electric vehicles, maybe electric ferries, more public transit, high-speed rail, etc. You could do hand-washing sound, that's like this. So this could represent education that fosters non-dominating relationships with the non-human world. You could do finger snapping. This can represent regenerative food systems that grow rather than diminish biodiversity. You could tap or stomp your feet, representing any form of expanding justice for people, the non-human world, plants. Lastly, you could take those paper surveys, which I hope you'll fill out and return, but you can flap them, and that could represent wind, for example, or solar, or any other clean energy technology you want to imagine. So these are our instruments at hand. Choose your instrument. I'm gonna show some years. Actually, we'll go decade by decade on the screen. We'll start in 2030, 2040, 2050, and we're gonna go to 2100. So if a baby was born today, they'd be like 77, I think. Just to put that in perspective, it's not that far out. You can change your instrument at any time, and you could play more than one instrument if you're multi-talented. You could snap your hand and tap your feet, flap, even 3 at once, right? You might fall into sync with someone around you, or you might decide to play a loud solo if you think that there's one sector that needs a little more energy. Okay, so that's the basics. This is all both up to each of you individually and all of us together to make this climate jazz. Are you ready? Okay. Here we go. 2030. Let's hear it. And 2040. 2050. 2060. Let's bring it up a little bit. All right. 2070. 80, 2090, and 2100. Okay, Thank you all so much for participating in that experiment with me. I'm going to hand it back to Bianca now.
Thank you, Judy. That was wonderful. I'm waiting for this to turn on.
Oh, sure.
So we'll take questions now, and I'm going to run around with the mic so that everybody can hear your question. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll get to you hopefully with a working mic here soon. Thank you. That was amazing.
Yeah.
All right. Can you guys hear me? Yes, great. Okay. Any questions? Yes, there's one back here.
Hi, Judy. Thank you. That was wonderful. I was curious how you selected the instruments.
Good question. And it's a little hard to explain because I made them. Each of the instrument, it's not like I took a toolkit of pre-made instruments. I composed them with a software program called Super Collider that allows you to custom design your own sounds, and that gives me really high levels of control over, gives me the ability to shape the timbre, the swell of each note so that it's representing the data way that I want it to. But maybe to more answer your question, the way that I decided to choose how to create each instrument was really thinking about the impression that I wanted to leave based on the data. And also it's a lot of trial and error. I'm not like Beethoven who imagined the sounds and then just wrote them out there. Like, I probably deleted like 90% of what I compose after trying it, and I'm like, this doesn't sound the way that I want it to, and so I'll just keep trying until the sound feels right with the data that I have at hand.
Okay, so I'm used to seeing graphs and charts, so my brain was automatically converting this to visualize these fluctuations.
Mm-hmm.
So what would be the appropriate word for hearing them rather than visualizing them?
Yeah. Well, I kind of left this out of the talk just because it's technical jargon, but the word is sonification, and it's analogous to visualization. When we make a chart, we're visualizing data, and when I turn it into sound, I'm sonifying the data. And, there's lots of, like the heart rate monitor is a kind of sonification. I've done a very kind of musical and artistic form of sonification so that I create a specific effect. But that's the word for it. And there are other people who are doing data sonification as well. It's tended to be a lot of astronomy data is where most people are doing sonifications. But there are also other people doing environmental science sound art as well.
I was just wondering in the earlier times why the temperatures went up and down, why we had 9 glacial periods.
Oh, thanks for asking that. That's a complicated piece of the glacial, interglacial cycles, and it gets back to something I said really quickly, which I can say a little bit more. So the Earth, as it's orbiting around the sun, has these little wobbles that we know physically we can predict them, and they correspond. It just changes how much sunlight the Earth receives. And so, and those are periodic. So when it shifts to a more or less sunlight position, then the ice ages start or end. Yeah, Earth's celestial motion around the sun. It's quite amazing. Yeah. So the question was, are we at the end of a cycle? And no, we're at the beginning of a cycle. Let's see, this data here. So at the very end, there's like that basically vertical line, right? But we're at the beginning of what may have been a very stable period for another few 100,000 years. Now, who knows? It's truly an unusual time in geologic terms.
Hi, Judy.
Hi.
I was wondering if your work has caught the attention of any scientists, people maybe in our government, or maybe when you go to DC, it'll be introduced to people. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, the reason I wanted to do this in the first place was because it just, working inside the academy and doing climate research felt very frustrating, because I wanted to be right at the intersection of broadening kind of awareness of science. So has it caught the attention? I mean, I got to present it in front of thousands of people on a stage in Seattle, which reached, and then reaches more people on the interwebs. I don't know who will be in the audience at the National Gallery of Art. It's actually caught more attention from artists looking for ways of representing data, or from musicians, than from other scientists, because scientists are so gosh darn busy just trying to do their research and get to the next, get through the grant cycle, that I found there's not always a lot of time. Even though there's a lot of support and interest, there's not a lot of time. I had to, not do science full term and switch to doing this because I didn't have time to do both.
to do both.
Mm-hmm. By the way, can I just tell you all that question came from my first grade teacher.
Thank you, Judy. That was awesome. Do you believe, in your opinion, after studying all this, that there's a way out for us?
Oh, I almost included a sign that you might remember. Oh, gosh. I almost included a slide. I'll tell you the story. My stepdad died a year and a half ago, and he was a collector and a tinkerer what are the names of the cars? These beautiful Tonka cars. Thank you, Aunt Paula. Tonka trucks. I have a lot of friends in the audience right now. He was an amazing person in so many ways. And so he had in his office, he was also a minister, but in his office he had this wall, or this shelf up the top where he had beautifully refurbished all these Tonka trucks. And when he died, the day after he died, my mom walked into his office. And just to set this up, he was very particular about everything, and things were placed very soundly in his workroom. She walked into the room, and a sign fell off the wall, and it said, "No U-turn." And I almost included that here, because no, there's no going back. We're going forward. We're going forward into a very unknown future, and this is, again, why I'm enjoying reading climate fiction, because it really helps us to not feel as much fear about that, but to start opening up wonder. Not to say that there are horrific changes that will happen from this, including lots of relocation and lots of suffering. And there has always been lots of suffering. So that's what I got. Oh, this question was, what's your favorite climate fiction book? I have a slide for you. Well, then I have to jump forward. I put them up here on a slide in case someone asked. So my favorite is at the top, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, Amitav Ghosh's Gun Island, which arguably isn't I don't know how to say it. It's scary, but it's also interesting. Kim Stanley Robinson, Ministry of the Future, Emily St. John Mandel, Sea of Tranquility. Grist just published a whole collection of short stories called Afterglow that I've just begun reading, and those specifically were selected because they are future stories that we might find desirable. Richard Powers' The Overstory is another one.
Hey, Judy. Thank you so much for the talk.
Mm-hmm.
It was great. My question is, have you ever tried to transform two data variables over time into a piece of music? So for example, one variable can be the amount of carbon dioxide, and another one can be the population, Earth populations, or some other variables that could relate it to carbon dioxide on the same piece of music?
Not yet. And I think I have experimented a little bit, and one thing that I try to do is make the pieces very clear, so it's really clear to the listener what's happening, even though sometimes it's still confusing, right? There's a lot that your brains have to do because you're not used to listening to data represented through sound. And so in my experiments, it's been tricky. And so if I find that I feel like it's too complicated and people aren't going to be able to follow what's happening, then I shift back to very simple. So like the most complicated thing here was where you're listening to like a year and then a month and weekly data all superimposed. But yeah, none of the pieces I put out into the public have more than one variable yet, but it's definitely possible. Yeah. Yes.
What do you feel is the most significant thing that that we as individuals can do in regards to this, to be helpful to the environment, to be helpful to nature and the world we live in?
Yeah. There's so many different ways to answer this question. I'm going to just go back here. Oops. Whatever good you're doing already, keep doing it, right? I think right now, so much of my energy is raising this toddler, raising kids to be as resilient as possible, as resourceful as possible, as loving and compassionate as possible, fostering community. And then, of course, the basic things like transitioning to clean energy as fast as we can. But that's the answer that you almost always hear. So I wanted to offer a few other things too. Yeah. Yep.
Judy, I have a question here. You mentioned that when you were working on this project, that you would generate different drafts of music, of sound recording and so on, and you discarded many of them because they didn't feel right. And then you came on some that did feel right. And I'm curious, what parts of you do you draw on in trying to develop that feel? What threads, what parts of you come to bear that lead you to say this is right and this is not right?
It depends on the piece. So the piece where I had this aha moment of like, this is what I wanted to sound like, more than any other piece that I've composed, is a piece for piano of the record of Arctic sea ice. That will be performed at the National Gallery next month. And with that piece, I'd been to the Arctic, I'd done research in the Arctic Ocean, and so I was really connecting myself to the environment and to the feeling that I had of being on the ice, on the sea ice over the ocean, and representing the best that I could what that environment, but also what the story of that data told me. With the glaciations piece, I started with the sense that this is orbital motion that's causing this change. And so I listened to some other pieces, digital sound compositions that sound like orbital motion, planetary motion. There aren't very many, but I used those as inspiration to try to compose sounds that kind of give that sense of a planet spinning around. And then with the other pieces, the shorter term pieces, you know, I mean, the In Situ 1988 and 2014, with those, because I was really going for being able to listen to week and month and year all at the same time, I wanted a bit more percussive sound because those pieces were rhythmic. So drawing on a combination of where does the data come from, what's the story the Earth is telling us that I want to help express, what are the tools that I have at hand, maybe some examples also. All those different things come in the composition process.
Hi, I just wanted to say, first, thank you very much, because I deeply felt in myself those changes that you displayed and that I heard. And also, I just wanted to ask you, being in the scientific community, what couple of things do you know that are going on that give you great optimism?
Well, optimism is a complicated word, and yet, actually, despite what I said at the beginning about the 24-hour news cycle of endless political dysfunction and violence, it's not always political dysfunction. There was just last week a Treaty of the High Seas that was signed that's getting nations of the world to agree on how to govern the oceans outside of the nearshore zones. In addition, as difficult and as long as they have been, the climate negotiations are going somewhere. Governments are making commitments. We have to hold ourselves and other countries accountable. But in the last 3 years in particular, since I've been doing this work in particular, there has been a shift in the level of understanding of urgency across all sectors of society. Now, it's not to say, great, let's, put our hands up and say it's going to be fine. But there is a shift. And, the other thing that I like to remember is that, for the major shifts in society, it doesn't take everybody on board to, for example, pass landmark legislation. It takes about 25% of people thinking it's really important. So those are a few things. Yeah.
Thank you, Judy. Are there any other questions? Or should we wrap up? Oh, one more.
Hi, Judy. Thank you. That was really wonderful. I'm wondering if you've composed a piece for how you would like the future of CO2 levels to be. And if you haven't, would you please? I would love to hear it.
No, this was the first one we just did. I have not put a piece out in public. Part of my doctoral exam part of my doctoral process involves a general exam. And in the general exam, I was given this test question of taking climate model data and writing a piece for the future of projections of the future. And maybe I'll go back and kind of work on that piece again and put it out in the public. But I didn't, although it was a very transformative process for me, because even though I'd looked at climate model data a lot and run my own climate models, I was taking projections of the changes in precipitation in the Arctic in particular and sonifying that and just listening to the differences. For me, even though intellectually I already knew what it sounded like, listening to the differences did make a kind of a sense of like, there's these different paths. We don't know which path we're on. So yes, I've had in the back of my mind to go back and kind of do more future projections, and I haven't yet. And I'll tell you the reason why is because I really like working with data from the Earth, and so in presenting data from the Earth rather than presenting model projections of the future. But they are helpful, so maybe I will. Thanks for that question.
Okay, we're going to do one more question, and then we'll break, and I'm sure Judy will be around to answer more things personally if you have a question for her. So.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a question for you. Based on the work that I do, that pitch cannot be lower, the high pitch that we have now, that you show in your music. It cannot be lower because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years. Do you know any industry or any research done in scrubbing that, on lowering that pitch?
Well, I think your question is, yeah, it does stay in the atmosphere for a long time, and a lot of it's also absorbed by the oceans. And there are technologies, carbon sequestration technologies that are being researched. I don't put a lot of faith in them. Nothing has been shown to be viable at large scale yet. I think the transitions that we need to come from a reduction in emissions of CO2 rather than trying to suck it out of the atmosphere. And yet, if those technologies take off and do become scalable, great, that will be helpful.
Yes, we talk about clean energy, but to my knowledge, there is nothing clean still created. We just sacrificing something to obtain something. Then where do we draw a line on how much we sacrifice on other areas of the environment to try to make our car less polluting?
Mm-hmm. It's true, we don't get any energy for nothing. Yet, over the last decade or so, there has been a tremendous growth in the efficiency of wind power, solar power, and other clean energy technologies. So we're moving in the right direction there. And also, we need to just reduce the amount that we're using. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today, and I'll be outside if you want to talk more.
Thank you, Judy. Remember to fill out your survey forms and turn them into the front desk before you leave if you can. Thanks, everybody.